convinced all of you to jump into this. I can at least get us started. So. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I think this is going to be a super fun event. Really excellent faculty members that have a lot to say. Different backgrounds, different subjects. This coming July 10th actually marks the 100th anniversary of the state of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes, which is otherwise known as the Scopes Monkey Trial, which is a debate about who gets to teach what in schools. And it seems like after 100 years, this would be kind of old history. And why would we want to talk about this? There's been some great movies on this, by the way, too, you could look up. The thing is, this is such a ground zero historical event for so many debates that we are still having today. The role of science in society, who gets to be an expert, who decides what gets taught to our kids in schools, who controls schools. And it became also a moment where public education had grown. So this wasn't a debate in 1822 because there wasn't a public school system, right? So you would either do your own homeschooling or in the church or wherever, right? So this kind of modern system that we live in today in terms of schools and the role of government in this and funding and who gets to make laws, all of this was coming together at this moment. And for the last 100 years, in so many ways, this trial has still been debated and carries on. And so with that, we thought it would be important for us to come together and bring our experts in to talk about it. So I want to say thank you. I know everyone will do their intros, but thank you to this group. This is an excellent group of folks from Moraine Valley. I'm looking forward to this, so I'll turn it over to Mary. Thank you, Mary. Or to
I don't really have too much to add to that other than my name is Mary Fiefley-Stunkel. I teach history and political science and sociology here at the college, and I'm here to moderate this fantastic panel of educators before you. And so I'm going to allow them, they're going to introduce themselves, and then we're going to start with kind of an overview of the events of the Scopes trial. And then from there, we'll kind of take it to some wider subjects that still resonate today. So, Kevin, you want to start us off?
Hi, I'm Kevin Avertell, and I teach political science.
Hi, I'm Mary Barney, and I teach philosophy.
Hi, I'm Josh Fulton, and I teach history.
Hi, my name's Nick Hackett, and I teach biology.
Josh, you want to start us off giving us some background and overview of the history of what happened to John Scopes, teacher of biology in Dayton, Tennessee?
Sure, no problem. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for that. Good afternoon, everyone. In terms of, overviewing a few elements as it relates to this particular trial, I think there's a few things to keep in perspective. So generally, what are we talking about? We're talking about a trial that occurs in Dayton, Tennessee, and occurs in July of 1925, where John Scopes is ultimately convicted. But it is a conviction that is overturned later on a technicality that he was fined excessively, I believe the phrase, quote unquote, was, for violating something referred to as the Butler Act, that was a law about the teaching of evolution in public schools. So generally, that's kind of some of the basic parameters here, that you have a young biology teacher who agrees to be a party to this case, that he had taught evolution, and becomes a test case for this particular law. But within the context of that time, within the context of 1925 and what life is like in America, I think that there's a number of elements that need to be viewed in consideration to that trial and to that period and also that region of the country. So you certainly have to, in thinking of, okay, why does this become a test case here? Why does this become a focus in this place? So you have to think about Tennessee. All right, so 1920s, you're looking a couple of generations removed from the American Civil War. So there's still certainly discussions about Reconstruction going on. There's still conversations and discussions about aspects of religion, about fundamentalism, and about the view of religion within the transformations that are happening within American life. So you move from a later industrial and progressive age into a time of World War I, which you see a strong intersection between America's war effort and very distinct interpretations of Christianity, to the point where you would see, you know, images of soldiers deployed as if they were, you know, medieval crusaders. So you're still dealing with that kind of imagery. There is something referred to as the World Christian Fundamentalist Association, right, that was formed basically right after the war. So you have these kinds of themes, but you also have the themes of those who sought to put this trial on relating to aspects of public entertainment and performance, in that WGN radio, although of course radio has somewhat in the last generation declined as a medium through which individuals get entertainment and news and this kind of thing, this is sort of the first public trial broadcast in America. And WGN puts this on the radio at this point in time for folks to hear. So you have, in addition to all of that, these changes that are going between sort of rural life and what urban life, or quote unquote modern life, is representing. And so you have, even within its own time, those who would put many layers of context onto that, even within the period of the 1920s.
Do you mind if I also jump in on that?
Go right ahead. Go right ahead.
Just to add a little bit more context too, right? That this is also just a couple of years after the first Red Scare, right? This is a time of kind of this fear of all these foreigners coming in, right? This is a year after we've just passed a very restrictive immigration act.
Oh yeah.
Right, and shortly after, a little bit after the formation of the American Civil Liberties Union, which is the group that actually offered to, we're going to tag team here, Josh and I a little bit,
Sure.
To basically kind of fund Scope's trial, knowing that probably he would be found guilty of the crime of teaching evolution, which is kind of a theme. You see that a lot throughout the 1920s, though, this constant fear of this pushback of modernity versus kind of like the status quo, this idea of change, this constant fear of change.
It very much, to build on what you were saying, you know, is that time of, you know, kind of, yeah, I mean, you know, the 20s is often looked at as this sort of period of the roaring 20s, right? It's this period in which radio's introduced, new technologies are being introduced, right? 1920 is the first census where there's more individuals living in an urban setting than living in a rural one. But simultaneously to that, the most popular community organization in America in the 1920s is the Klan. And so I think that, if anything, is indicative of this angst and anger and concern that is playing out daily in the lives of individuals.
Right.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to open it up to the wider group, because we had discussed this a little bit before as well. So Kevin, I don't know if you want to jump in and talk about just politically how this issue sort of still resonates today, because we know that Scopes was found guilty, but this issue, it wasn't like it just kind of went away in 1925, right? There are still, according to a recent Time magazine article, 17 states that continue to teach creationism alongside evolution. But we have discussions today about the idea of books being banned that are not even related to evolution, but just books that are seen as perhaps the themes of them as being quote unquote dangerous. So what political themes perhaps would you like to kind of draw out and discuss?
Yeah, well, first of all, that's a good setup both to Josh and to you and to Troy to kind of frame this the way that even after 100 years, this is still a very prominent issue, and there's a lot of different issues that we could apply to this framework. And partly it's like every day the news is a little bit, there's something new, and this morning when I opened or checked online and read the Washington Post, there was an article about a Florida teacher who lost her job for calling a student by her preferred name without parental consent, which now violates a Florida law. So we see just a huge scope of government control, whether it's at the federal level, state level, local level with school boards, you know, using their authority to protect students against content that they deem inappropriate. That could be due to sexual, racial, or political content. There's a continued suspicion of elites and experts and of science. We've recent, weeks and months and years, we've seen schools dropping diversity, equity, inclusion, which I think is very similar to kind of the teaching evolution of that kind of pushback against that, where funding for schools is now contingent on eliminating DEI. In this, the White House last week is now threatening to deny Title I funding for students, which is federal funds that go to low-income families, unless state education leaders can prove that they're not, that they've eliminated all programs related to diversity, equity, inclusion. They don't define diversity, equity, inclusion. So it's very there's a lot of ambiguity. And I just want to point out, like, since 2017, in like a 6-year time period between 2017 and 2023, 38 states adopted 114 laws that either restricted what could be taught in the classroom or expanded it. 66% of the new laws restricted content of what can be taught and related to race and diversity in the classroom, and 34% of the new laws expanded them. And so we can see that just in places like Illinois, where regionally, the state next door, like Indiana, they're restricting what can be taught in the classroom, and then Illinois, we're expanding it and requiring what is taught related to race and history and diversity, equity, inclusion. I'm thinking about laws like banning books in Indiana. There's laws that are banning books from being in libraries. Illinois is banning bans on books. So just to see the way that states are going in very different directions. A 2023 Kentucky law forbids lessons on human sexuality before 5th grade, outlaws all instruction exploring gender identity. Oklahoma, their state superintendent has pushed Bibles in every classroom. They've recently creating curriculum that asked students to identify discrepancies in the 2020 election as part of their U.S. history classes. I think we could get into vaccinations and schools adopting patriotic education. There's just a whole bunch that you could get into, and some of this is even pertinent to college, restrictions on colleges and diversity, equity, inclusion, and so there's definitely a lot of modern applications today.
We could definitely circle back to some of those topics. Thank you. Mary or Nick, I don't know who wants to jump in first.
Should I? Okay. So when I was asked to think about this topic and how it relates to philosophy, I came up with a couple different ideas. Mainly, I was thinking about the historical distinction that philosophers make between belief and knowledge, and how important that distinction is in philosophy. Knowledge has traditionally been defined as justified true belief, meaning that it is something that is true. You, the believer, believe it, and you can explain what it is that you believe and why. That was Plato's definition. It's been challenged, and there are reasons to talk about that, but not here. I also think that in philosophy, it kind of bouncing off of both of these other gentlemen's introductions, is the importance of experts in their field. We teach that over and over and over. There's even a fallacy in philosophy of appealing to the wrong sort of authority. And so I think it's really important to note that in philosophy, we would want the scientists to be the ones to explain the science to us, for what it's worth. And that the other idea I really wanted to get to, besides that difference between belief and knowledge, is the idea of falsifiability. In science and in the science of philosophy, this notion of falsifiability has become pretty well founded and well respected. If you cannot test your scientific idea, if you cannot test your hypothesis, if it's untestable, then it's unfalsifiable. And what that means is you're not doing science. You might be doing something else, and that's fine. There's no judgment, but you're not doing science. And I think that that notion of falsifiability is really, really important to philosophers around this issue as well. The creation story is not a falsifiable scientific hypothesis. It is a belief, or it is a belief. Ultimately, in philosophy, we decided that the scientists aren't just always right. So for what it's worth, that's not at all what I'm saying. But what they do help us do is get farther away from what is false, even if they haven't gotten us any closer to knowing the absolute truth.
Excellent point. I think we can turn this off. I think we definitely I want to circle back to this idea about the importance of expertise and that the idea of the fallacy of appealing to the wrong sort of authority. I want to give Nick also a chance to jump into, and then we can kind of circle back to some of these topics.
Yeah, thank you. You know, as a biologist, the surface of this seems to be they're debating this very core idea in biology, which is the theory of evolution, and debating this or its conflict with especially Christian views really went back to the origin of Charles Darwin writing and introducing his ideas in the book. So this went back, 50, 60, 70 years before this trial. But what I find so interesting is that it's not so much about evolution, is that kind of what Professor Fulton was speaking about, is that this was kind of like a show trial. Like it was meant to display people debating this very controversial topic, which is still controversial. Today we have like movies and TVs and all of this media that does this, but in the 20s they really didn't. They had just introduced radio, which was really the birth of all of these things. And so as much as this is about the tenets of biology or evolution, which we've learned a tremendous amount about since the 1920s, a lot of this is really how we debate things in public, or how people like talk about ideas, or what is morality. And I think we see that in all kinds of media now. There's all kinds of things like this in movies. There's all kinds of TV shows that are like this too. Some of them are more fantastic, but some of them are very much real life situations, maybe even reality TV, where we debate things that are like this. They have no simple answer.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we want to go back to this idea, because expanding on what both of you were just saying, this notion of where we're seeing in modernity. And if, by the way, if anybody has questions or they've got comments or you just want to jump in, I think we're kind of running a pretty informal group here. So if you've anything you want to chime in on, please feel free to do so. So what are your thoughts on just sort of, I think because of the nature of Google, right? Because of this ability of having so much knowledge and information at our fingertips, I think a lot of us feel as though we're sort of experts in everything, right? You go to a doctor and you've got, doctors having to contend with Dr. Google, and I'm looking this up, and even though there's, they're not being put in context, and so what are your thoughts on that and how it relates to some of the things that we're seeing today, whether it is a disbelief or skepticism of vaccines, and things of that nature. And if you have other topics you want to chime in on too, but just this notion of this disbelief in expertise, and how expertise is being is reduced as being less than important. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, when Josh ended earlier, I was thinking about when he was bringing up the Roaring '20s, just this rapid change, and I know we've all kind of talked about that time period of radio, and it's hard for us to imagine like how transformative that was, of being able to find out what's going on in the world in your living room. And I think, 100 years, 2025, we've got a lot of new technology, and this technology's been very disruptive as well, whether that's social media and artificial intelligence. And I think there is a backlash against these, in eras of rapid change, there's going to be a backlash, and maybe people trying to assert more control over their lives. And part of that ties back into people learning and what are they being taught in schools. So I do think, and we're in today's era, you are a click away, not necessarily from being an expert, but from finding something that might confirm what you already believed, to Professor Barney's point. And so there isn't necessarily evidence to prove your point, but maybe cast doubt on other people's points. And so you feel like you can just, well, if you go to this website, or if you go to this influencer, or if you go to this whatever, you can somehow have your own pre-existing beliefs validated. So I do think that that's a challenge in today's media ecosystem, information ecosystem. It's much more decentralized. And I think if you combined the rapid change of our era with the decentralization of the way that people get their information, we probably wouldn't be surprised to have some of the topics that we've been putting out there as far as being divisive amongst people.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Josh, please, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Building off of what he was saying and what you were asking as well, I was listening to you and thinking a little bit about sort of World War I.
Josh, come a little closer to the
Oh,
microphone.
sorry. I was thinking a little bit about World War I and access and control to information. I was thinking specifically about, during, 7, 8 years before the trial begins, America's involved in World War I. You see at the local sort of school district level an effort to convince young people, both at the high school as well as even in colleges. I mean, that's why Western Civ classes in college got started, was the idea that they were supposed to be teaching folks, wartime European issues, like that kind of deal. But there were in some states what was called the War Catechism, which was to be taught to young people. And so it's sort of the state is getting in the business of believing it can control aspects of information and how it's disseminated. I mean, it's part of the reason why in debates and discussions over things like, Germanism or anti-Germanism during the war, you had the idea of restricting books. And in one case, I did find in my own research for my dissertation on World War I of, oh yeah, they were burning books in Iowa. They were burning German-related books in Iowa. That was absolutely a thing. Not I'm against Iowa or anything like that, but that kind of control also would extend to things like why you see so many groups at the time wanting to influence things like the memory of the Civil War and sort of that kind of stuff. And so it's a time in which the state, because of the manner in which information is disseminated and conveyed, can have greater control. And in some ways, in a more modern sense, to your point, in these days, to Kevin's point as well of decentralization, it's a lot harder to do that now.
Yeah.
Would you mind repeating your question?
About expertise and the issue of why we're having such a clash today about with the importance of why there's such a disbelief, if you will, if that's the right word.
Okay.
About the importance of expertise.
I just wanted to be sure. I have a feeling about this, and I think it's based on 15 years now of teaching intro to philosophy and critical thinking, that students and really Americans in general outside of academia are terrified of taking a position on anything publicly. They don't know what the experts in the field actually think. They only know what they've seen on Google. They aren't certain of their opinions, and so they don't know what they don't know. most of my students, I'm teaching a course on fascism this semester, and most of my students were unwilling at the end of the text on how fascism works to say that fascism is a flawed ideology. They were unwilling to say that because they believe that everything has to be given its respect and its due merit. And so there might be fascists out there who think fascism is a good thing, right?
The two sides to every story.
Both sidism, yes.
Very interesting.
I think there's a really interesting idea here too about it feels as though there are a lot of experts, but I think that we're so buried in information that people are simply looking into like the digital world for answers. And if that information can be curated to you, you feel like you see the expert, like, oh, here's this TikTok video of this doctor, what they say makes sense. And in your mind, it's like that box is checked off. You don't have to worry about that. That's one less detail of all of this information that we have to worry about. And so it goes back to this controlling the information. If we control or curate that information, people believe that they're hearing the experts and they're just hearing whoever it is that pops up.
But believing it to be.
But believing it to be right, because
gospel,
like we
quote,
can only hold so much information and we're, you know, probably incapable of understanding so much of it. You know, like you talk about new technology, so much of that is just like we're still figuring out what to do with the fact that all this information is instantaneously available.
Right.
Do you have something you want to add on that, Kevin, or you want, because I.
You know, I do. I think that's a well said. And I was just taking down some notes, and I was thinking, like, I don't know that we've specifically brought up COVID yet, but I think this was another key variable in this evolution of skepticism of experts in science, and we all lived through it, and clearly the masking, you know, the policies on masking changed. Some of the recommendations by experts evolved. I think during this time period of having school closures, that kind of was two things. It allowed parents maybe to see what their students were being, or their kids were being taught, and some of that, I think, made them uncomfortable. And then secondly, the just having your kids at home while you were trying to work also was very upsetting to many parents who felt like they weren't able to get their own work done, and they like, why are these kids still not in school? And you know, in retrospect, to see the number of kids who, you know, had serious complications with COVID. So I think that this time period was also one of those where people became their own experts and felt like the true experts may have gotten some things wrong or changed their minds, or I definitely think this was another key development in this long history of skepticism towards experts in science, and having your beliefs feel validated. And again, you have all kinds of information now that is out there that you can use to support your pre-existing beliefs.
And probably magnified now by the type of media that we have now. Because as we were talking, I had highlighted a couple of quotes in here, but there's one in here about from the this is the section in history textbook, from the Scopes trial, talking about radio, and this was talking about Herbert Hoover and talking about the benefits and of the dangers also of radio. But he said that if the future of our democracy depends upon the intelligence and cooperation of its citizens, radio may contribute to its success more than any other single influence. And I think we're kind of seeing now, I think with social media, that it's also can contribute to its demise as well, right? If there's a lack of controls, or if it's just kind of unfettered access with and now that we're seeing a lot of the social media companies who are private companies that are controlling this access to information, you know, what are those implications for the information that people are receiving? And then what implications does that then therefore have on democracy? What does that have on implications for parents and what they believe, right? So it's kind of a, not really necessarily a question, but I just don't know if any of you have any thoughts on that.
I think for the longest time it felt like controlling information was censorship. And now I think that we almost have to change that idea, because we never thought that you would be confronted with like an ocean of misinformation or nonsense, really. And so I think it's interesting how those two intersect. That, you know, when I think about the government controlling information, it feels more like censorship, like a fascist kind of thing. But what do we do about an engine that just produces misinformation that clearly can influence people?
Unbridled information, yeah. Any of you have any thoughts on that?
It was just rhetorical.
We were talking today in my class about how propaganda leads people to do irrational things and to act against their own best interests. And that's what I was thinking of as you were asking that question, is how much of what we hear, I think when people use the term fake news, they actually mean propaganda. That's what we're getting. And that is dangerous because it leaves people with an absence of knowledge where knowledge is necessary to make the right sorts of decisions.
I'd just add that, you know, if you were to have a hypothesis in the 1980s that predicted the information environment that we have today, of where you're more likely to get your information from your phone, through social media, through some maybe influencer, some influencer who has more followers than your traditional a journalist on, I don't know, ABC News or something like that, where they have more followers, more clicks, more. And I would think that you know, if you played this out, if you made the hypothesis in the 1980s, you'd probably get the exact kind of climate that we have today, of the type of leaders who are more likely to navigate successfully and win elections in this type of information environment, where you'd more likely have the, you know, debates over some of the topics like that we're talking about, where everybody feels like they know better than maybe the science or the experts or the data shows. So I mean, I think going back through time, when you've ever had these huge developments in technology, that you've had these same debates, and so I think it's somewhat predictable.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair.
I would, to build on my colleagues, I would say that it's making me think about two things. One is the importance of information literacy. You know, I think that's a lot of what we're all sort of speaking to here, and I know that's something I try to emphasize in my classes as well. But in contextually thinking about the Scopes trial and sort of that time, I'm also thinking about that as in addition to the, you know, kind of urban versus rural, modern versus whatnot. You know, this is also the time in which, you know, kind of coming out of World War I, you have this first real definitive effort in America at marketing. And at, you know, building on the propaganda, you know, sort of the World War I era, where you have these first real, you know, mass marketing companies, because you now have these new tools like radio and all these others, where you can attempt to convince the public in ways that you would not have been able to have those tools to do that, you know, in a previous circumstance, which led, of course, to huge fights among marketers about how do you do this correctly, what's the right way to do this, and, you know, how do you do this ethically, how do you know, all that stuff.
Sure, absolutely. So I thought of a question while you were all talking, and it's a bit of a doozy. I'm not sure if you're comfortable answering it, so if you're not, that's okay. I'm just wondering though, if any of you, and I'm open to answering it too, have you felt that in the current environment that we're in, have you found yourself self-censoring in the classroom over certain topics? Because, you know, Mary, you're teaching subjects that kind of overlap a lot of what I think what Kevin and Josh and I talk about too, just in a different way. And I wonder if you have encountered that yourselves, where you have felt, you know, maybe I shouldn't say that, just given the digital age that we're in, or just again the political environment that we're in.
I haven't, but I could see how people would. And I was trying to think in the time that you asked that question whether I really have, and off the top of my head, I don't think I have, but I know that in Florida there's now a law where students can record their professors in the classroom and potentially share that information and have professors be fired, and we're seeing in some states like that tenure is being eroded for faculty. And I know Jonathan Hay is a professor at NYU who I follow really closely. I think he's really, really smart. And I've listened to podcasts and videos where he has said he self-censors, that he doesn't. So I think it really depends upon the environment that you're in, and I can see why some people might. I think we're living in such a transformative time period that I try to bring in those topics that I think are really, really prominent and relevant and transformative. And it's hard for me to not have a position on them. I think I try to juxtapose the arguments as best as I can, or maybe point out when it's my opinion or that you don't have to agree with me to the best of my ability. But I think it's important that we don't shy away from the issues that are really prominent in our lives today.
And is it, sorry, Mary, I was going to ask a question, and you don't have to answer this, but I wonder if the nature of where we are at as a community college is perhaps we're insulated a bit differently than perhaps we would be at a different institution. I don't know, but sorry. Please.
I was going to say I basically agree with what Kevin just said. I haven't censored myself, I don't think, in any particular way. I'm always careful about how much of my own opinion comes out in critical thinking class, because the goal is to get the students to form their own opinions, not to just accept mine. I lost my train of thought.
It happens to me all the time. You're talking about critical thinking and wanting the students to develop their own trains of thought, and that you don't really see yourself self-censoring.
Yeah, I don't see myself self-censoring. In fact, I think I got a little more radical. I was like, shoot, what am I going to do about this? And then I decided to have a class on fascism. I think that there are certainly people who do feel concerned, and what I was going to say is I have a sister who works in a major university out on the East Coast, and they have been told to cut their DEI programs, and they have been told that they will lose funding if they don't, and there are a letter went out to the entire faculty saying they have to justify their positions. It's just terrifying.
Wow.
So I do think being in a community college, we're probably insulated slightly from that, because the attack is going to start outside of the community colleges.
Sure.
And probably eventually make its way to us.
Yeah. Do either of you, Nick or Josh, do you have anything you want to add?
I mean, I can. Certainly I would echo probably a similar approach to both Kevin and Mary, in that largely, to my knowledge, I don't think that I've necessarily censored myself, in that I've often, I think even from, I was so anxious when I started working here anyway, that, even before this time, I often thought that there was something watching me anyway, and so always be mindful of that, but that's just me and my own issues between myself and my therapist that we're working through, but, so there's a certain element of that, I would say, but, making sure, I think that, you're being mindful of, kind of how different issues are approached and how you're integrating sort of different things in the way that I might do it. So like, for example, I will commonly teach History 202, which is a class that runs from just past the Civil War, basically up to today for American history. And there's, of course, so many different elements to navigate with something like that. And I'll sort of address it of the, look, we can all agree and be very prideful that America won World War II, of, that we had a strong hand in that process. Did we get everything perfect along the way? No. Is it okay to admit that? Yeah. Does it make us bad people for saying that? No, because nobody's perfect. It's okay. But we still won, and that's okay, and it's okay to be prideful. But, it's kind of how do you navigate that part?
Sure.
So, it's interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what I would say.
Thanks.
I just wanted to say, as a biology teacher, I feel really lucky that I've never had to censor this. And I kind of feel like as a biology teacher, it's my job to be the defender of the idea of evolution. But at the same time, like in teaching for a while and looking at people with different backgrounds and things like that, you become aware of the things that you say and how you don't want those to be misconstrued. And so I'm never looking to irritate anybody or like twist the knife about evolution. I really welcome the debate. And again, I don't see it as a right or wrong thing anymore. I see it more as there's a value in the debate. But you know, it's hard not to talk about modern issues without having some sort of political spin. And in sitting here, I wanted to say, like, no, I teach science, there's no political element. But it's hard to talk about things like vaccine rates and not talk about some sort of political side to that. And there's all sorts of things like this. Like, there's a very serious measles outbreak right now in Texas. And there's a political side to that. And so it's hard to leave that out when you're talking about the science. And so I try to be very mindful of it. I try to not put myself in a situation where I would be belittling somebody or their ideas, but I do see myself as like the defender of the idea of evolution, and I take that side.
Nick, do you ever have students that will challenge even the notion of evolution itself? Have you ever had that in a biology class, or is that not something that usually happens at the college level?
I don't know that I've had it happen. I've talked to people about it, and again, like my approach has been for a while that it's not incompatible with people's religious beliefs, that evolution is about describing like what we see on Earth and how that formed or where it came from or those ideas, like you can fill that in from your own beliefs if that's what's appropriate.
Right.
But no, I really feel like most students are really respectful of it. You know, I present it as like, here's the idea, and certainly here is the evidence, and that's a big part of how we teach it. Yeah.
I do want to ask
Mary, real quick,
Yeah,
just to,
please.
I think it,
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please.
Lisa Marizzi, I teach humanities here for Moraine Valley. I teach 101 and 102, and in 102 we talk about Darwin's theory of evolution and just what's going on. Today we're talking about communism and just everything that's going on in the world and, you know, about false, you know, fake news, blah, blah, blah. I have found, I try not to voice my own opinion. I want my students not to be sheep. I want them to do their own homework and have their own opinion, you know, formulate their own opinions. And I just, here's the facts. Here are the facts. Here is the reality. You know, what do you think? And try to have those conversations about that. And the scientists, yeah, we were talking about Darwin's theory of evolution about a month ago. And we sat down and we looked at it. Like, here is Darwin's theory. Okay, here's the creation story. What's the problem? It's really just timing. And eventually we will be talking about Einstein and his theory of revelation and like, relativity, yes. And that's all about timing. And it's like, so human timing, God's timing. Yeah, and we look at all of that and like, really, what is the issue? What is the problem? Why are people so, they have knowledge. Knowledge is the true power. Let's explain it. Let's take a look at it. You know, scientific version and, you know, those people who are not into math and science, okay, well, here, the creation story. There you go. Very simplified version of the same story. But yeah, I'm with you guys, like, the facts. Let's lay out the facts. Form your own opinion. Like, don't get caught up in all the, everything that's on the internet. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Actually, I was just going to ask if people had questions
Thanks.
or people had comments. Are there questions or comments from the audience? Do you have one? Look like are you formulating one? You're thinking?
yeah.
Okay. I was going to actually ask a little bit more, since, Nick, I'm glad you brought that up, even about the idea of questioning of facts. And this kind of maybe relates to all of yours, but it's about even like the vaccine skepticism. And I think some of it has to do with, because if you were to, you know, we teach history and even with political science, you know, if you were to question somebody that lived through the years of World War II and earlier, that lived through no polio vaccine, things like, there's no question, right, of the efficacy of vaccines. But because we now have a generations of people who've lived with the benefits of having it, there's now this skepticism that exists, along with I think the fuel skepticism on social media as well. And I'm just wondering, if that's also a topic that's maybe come up, like have been debates in your class in biology about it? Have students, you mentioned something a little bit about it, have people been challenging the notion of vaccinations? You mentioned specifically the measles vaccine. Has that come up as a topic in class?
It hasn't necessarily come up. You know, we talk about the ideas. You know, like in class, I'll sometimes do a survey if people want to, you know, like tell me the information about what vaccines they've received. And I'm amazed at how few people get or how few they're aware of. So from there, that's about as much information as I can get about how people feel about it. So I'm not exactly sure, you know, I try to present the information a certain way, but yeah, I don't really get feedback, so I'm not sure, yeah.
Sure.
I actually have an article that I use to start my critical thinking classes, which start with like logic and heuristics and that kind of stuff, and then move into contemporary issues. The article is called "No, You're Not Entitled to Your Opinion," and it is written by a philosopher, and it is about why you are only entitled to what you can argue for. And the example given in the article is anti-vaccination campaigns. And I have never once had a student interrupt me or interject and say they have a problem with vaccines. In fact, most seem to agree that they are efficacious and good. What I have had is students walk out of my classroom when the topic of evolution comes up. That has happened.
Interesting.
There does seem to be something too about COVID and flu vaccines. You know, like nobody's really arguing a lot, I think, about a lot of the childhood vaccines or these things that people get and they never think of, right? But I feel like maybe it's just among young people and just the way that we deal with vaccines, but there does seem to be a lot of young people that don't get a flu shot or a COVID shot or things like that.
So the newer it is, the more skepticism there is.
Right, there's something about those too, and I wonder if they just have a kind of hook in social media, or there's been something about them, you know, a link to like this idea of autism or something. Because there's certainly plenty of other medical technologies that we never question, you know, like we don't, if you break your arm, you go to the doctor and they're going to fix your arm, you don't question any of that. But for some reason, the vaccine, I don't know. I'm not sure why that specific thing, you know?
It's something that comes up, like when I teach American History 1, sometimes I show some clips from the HBO miniseries John Adams. And in the series John Adams, there's a part where they show, it's amazing, where they show smallpox inoculations. And how Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, this is back in 1776, and it's in the spring when there's a smallpox epidemic that's raging throughout the countryside, and John Adams is in Philadelphia with the Continental Congress. She's off with the kids, and people are dying left and right of smallpox, and she makes the decision to vaccinate her kids. And they show it. They show this very rudimentary form of vaccination. And students are like, oh my God. And I talked to them a little bit more about how George Washington mandated vaccines. I'm like, well, how could he do that? And I said, well, why do you think he did it? And how can you fight with an army if your army is falling down left and right because they're getting smallpox? And so once I think you put them in a certain particular context, it's more understood. But I think that's what's missing is just sort of that putting that piece into the puzzle of in that context.
Just wanted to add a couple of points. The Scopes trial was really about whether the law was violated, not over science. And I think about that connection today. There's a bunch of issues one could select. But you brought up the vaccines, and at one point during the Biden administration, there was, I think it was an executive order that basically required any company over 100 people to, if you work for a company with 100 or more people, you had to have weekly testing or get vaccinated. And, you know, the Supreme Court shot that down. And, you know, and this is in the context of hundreds of thousands of people who have died from COVID. And I'm thinking of, you know, the facts or science, I guess, of this really wasn't investigated as much as the process of whether the president has this power. And then you're thinking about, and then, sorry, I'm going to be jumping all over, but like Venezuelan immigrants who are being deported to El Salvador under the Alien Enemy Act. The Supreme Court isn't dealing with truly they're not questioning whether the true facts of the case of whether whether the Venezuelan government is really trying to invade the United States. So we see these parallels of like the Supreme Court not really dealing with the science or facts or rationality, if you will, and more about the process. And then, you know, I think it was Nick, you brought this up about how it's newer with COVID and the flu vaccine, and we had talked about this before, but when people were dying from COVID, at least some people, you know, in their final moments, they're like, well, I still don't have COVID. Like they were still skeptical that this was really what was killing them, you know, and that is relatively new. These beliefs were just so strong, and they were so like, this is a hoax, and this is, and I you know, I think that's, I don't want to take us too far out of the, but one last thing, a little caveat to what I had said earlier about censoring ourselves is when I said that I could see why some people would, I just want to be clear. We had mentioned the Red Scare earlier. I think there's parallels today. I mean, there are people who have visas being revoked if they had, you know, been critical of Israel, if they have been supportive of, you know, Hamas or some of their statements. Like we're seeing academics who are being punished or either fired or deported or having their visas revoked. So, and graduate students. And so I don't want to try to, I think it really depends on your privilege and then where you teach and the state you teach and you know, so there's a lot of variables.
Absolutely. Do you have a question? Yeah, here. Let me bring the microphone so you could be heard.
Just something I thought of while discussing, just the rise of like COVID denialism and like the vaccinations. I think it has to, like again with the rise of social media, has something to do with the rise of people who want to profit off people denying vaccinations, I think. I know.
I mean, you could be speaking too to like the way the algorithms of the social media work, that whether they designed it this way, these things which are inflammatory get more hits or links or likes. And that drives this to be created more or copied more. And so I think that there are companies that are benefiting from it. Like whether they designed it directly that way or whether it's indirectly doing that, I think is really interesting. But I do think that's what we're seeing with social media.
Other questions for our panelists? I want to ask first, are there other topics that you perhaps wanted to broach that we have not? Oh, I'm sorry, yes. Sure. I can repeat the question, but.
Darwin's theory of evolution. You know, what's the problem? Why can't people embrace that? Like, who's trying to nullify that for their own benefits? Like, who would benefit by disproving, you know?
So the question is, who is benefiting off of denying or nullifying Darwin's theory of evolution?
We talk about that in class, like why, or like the houses of worship, why do they have an issue with this scientific explanation? What's their problem with Darwin's theory of evolution? Why do they have a problem? All this creationism. What's the problem?
So why are religious institutions, right, so why are religious institutions finding themselves in conflict with Darwinism, with evolution? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I was just thinking about group identity and how we form our identities in alignment with groups that are important or meaningful or values similar to ourselves. And so I think what happens in a lot of these cases is that you become part of the group first, and then all of the beliefs come with it, right? And so it's not necessarily that anyone is being harmed by evolution, but if you're part of this group identity, then you can't believe that thing. Does that make sense?
No, it does.
Yeah.
It does. Do you want to say something first?
Yeah,
I
I
had
mean,
something I was going to add.
It's not my area of expertise, but I do think that, if your faith has tenets that are being challenged by evolution, then that's a critical threat. So if people believe that their religious faith is being, some of the fundamental principles of it are being questioned by or compromised by evolution, and then trying to think of like similar parallels today, I think that there's, families may feel that schools, whether it's on gender, whether it's on race, if there's things that are challenging their fundamental belief systems that the family holds or that their religious faith holds, their community holds, they feel that is weakening their ties to their core of their identity.
And I think it depends on the religious institution, because I know in History 202, when you'd have discussions about the Scopes trial, and I would often ask students, like, how was it taught in school? And a lot of students that went to Catholic school, and I know, like, I went to a Greek Orthodox private school, it was taught, like, as in science class, biology, that was taught. Creationism was not taught. But what I was thinking of with your question was even how amongst evangelical Christians, how even like in the 60s and 70s, how women's reproductive rights was not really challenged as much, and it becomes a bigger deal in the aftermath of Roe versus Wade, and is seen as an ability to harness political power and gain traction. And even amongst like the Catholic Church, then it becomes a bigger wedge issue.
I mean, you're just like Trump, human story. The houses of worship always have an issue with what the scientists are doing.
Right.
Even Kepler, Copernicus, and Galileo. Well, wait a minute.
Right.
The sun is the center of, like, whoa, wait a minute. Forever it's been the earth. It's like, I just tell these authorities, like, take a minute, take a look at what the scientists have said.
Right.
It's not in conflict. It's not going to cause. It's not going to let you. It's not going to cause your authority in the world to
Right.
diminish. And take a look at it.
But I think that's the key point, though.
Education. That's what my students like. Get the facts.
Right. Right.
Not making a judgment.
Right.
Get the facts. It plays nice. It's fine.
Right, but I think that you just said it yourself. I think it's the key point, though. It's the idea of challenging, if the church is no longer the authority, in this case, going back to Galileo or whatever, on what it is, that's a problem, right?
Like this with evolution. It's fine. You really take a look at it.
Right.
Fine.
Right. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Any
I mean,
comments on that?
of course, like if part of your religion and your belief goes to like the core of you as a person, this is a threat to that as well. I'm sure that the group dynamics work into this. It's about identity, and if people believe that their children are being, it's almost like brainwashed the way that it's talked about. Like, if you say anything in school, it'll get into the children's head and never come out, and you can't do anything about it. But it's not just a threat to the institution. It felt like historically it was a threat to the institution, and now it's become a threat to the individual, right? Like, what are you doing to my kid in school?
Right. I'm curious to see how this is going to play out, though, even amongst religious groups, because we've seen, you mentioned the measles outbreak amongst the Mennonite community, and we've also seen measles outbreaks amongst Orthodox Jewish communities. And I wonder if, because as you're seeing diminishing declines of vaccination rates, right, the herd immunity is now lower, which means it can spread wider, right? So I wonder if we're going to start to see more pushback amongst sort of the mainstream, because if other people can kind of ride the herd, then they don't have to worry about their child. But if they no longer can do that because we're below, was it the 96% vaccination rate, if we're going to start to see that clash again of kind of religious values versus science. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about that or any comments. It's just my 2 cents. Are there any, I said we're at about an hour and 5 minutes. Troy, anything you want to add? I wanted to ask if anybody wanted to add anything from the group.
Sure. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add, so one thing that interests me with the Scopes trial, I don't know if you guys know it or not, but the kind of key, with the media attention with it, part of it was like the key players that have really interesting in Chicago.
Oh, Clarence Darrow.
Oh, absolutely.
Darrow, Jennings Bryant. I don't know if you guys have I have to say it's real blurry for me, but if you know, even because I'm sure
You meant like Darrow as the prosecuting attorney and Brian being a candidate that ran for president multiple times and. Right, right. We didn't really get into that too much. I was going to talk about the idea that how Brian. So for those of you that maybe don't know, and Josh, jump in anytime you want here.
Sure.
I don't know if I can necessarily comment as much about the Chicago connection, but the trial itself became this sort of open philosophical debate about evolution and about the Bible, and basically Clarence Darrow's cross-examining Brian on the stand about did Jonah swallow the whale or the whale swallow Jonah, and essentially if you were a person who believed in evolution, you thought that Clarence Darrow kind of wiped the floor with William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan, by the way, was not a person. His own evolution is kind of interesting, how he began to view evolution being taught in schools, but he died I think 4 days after the trial concluded, which was also interesting as well. But the Chicago connection itself, I don't. You want to jump in for me because I don't. Do you know, Josh? I'm drawing a blank on.
Well, Darrow was a lawyer partly in Chicago for a
Right.
time. There's certainly that.
The two guys.
Cross the Gold speech was in Chicago.
Oh, it's Cross the Gold here.
I thought it was Omaha, but-
Did Darrow defend the two guys, the Chicago ones, Leopold and Loeb?
Leopold and Loeb?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Leopold and Loeb.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
I mean,
another-
Brian in particular is a fascinating figure, yes, because in the 1890s, much like the 1920s was this period of, kind of rural versus modern. In many ways, so is the 1890s. It very much was this period where you have, very strong political active, it's a period of depression, and it's a period where you have this group known as the populists that are going to show up and very strongly advocate for rural communities and for farmers and for others, very strongly against the forces of urbanization and industrialization. Yes, that quote of, was it to paraphrase, burn down your cities and leave us our farms, right? Sort of that kind of thing. But that's growing out of, sort of unrest and opposition and sort of concern over industrial forces and others that are having on encroaching on rural communities in the 1870s, 1880s, and the 1890s, which certainly was happening. And Bryant, which, there's a great book on the trial and on the history of it by Edward Larson called Summer for the Gods, which if anyone is interested, it certainly speaks to a lot of what Dr. Swanson as well is saying about Brian and this kind of thing, and I had wanted to mention this because I know that there, a number of individuals have been commenting on how showy the trial was, how performative, essentially the trial was. Of one of the points that Larson makes is that you can and should, so I'm paraphrasing Larson here, you can and should connect this to what were called the Chautauquas, that particular movement of the late 1800s, early 1900s, which was this kind of circuit process, particularly near rural communities, where the idea was if you wanted to have public debate, make it entertaining. If you wanted to have educational debate, if you wanted to teach folks about stuff, you wanted to have speakers, make them interesting. And so you had these spaces and places. And someone like Bryant, even though he's no longer the Secretary of State by that particular point in time, Larson makes the point, he's making money on the speaker circuit he very much is making money on the Chautauqua circuit, like that kind of circuit. And what the point he makes is that you kind of have to look at the initial setup of the Scopes trial as kind of through that lens, that's really what they were kind of trying to set it up as, and that just became this much wider thing. But it very much connects back to that period. And so Bryant certainly would be a reflection of that in a whole lot of ways, in that you had the populists in the 1890s, you had the folks in the Grange movement in the 1870s of this very strong opposition to the transformations in American life that are occurring, and they definitely are quite pronounced.
One of the many trial of the centuries that existed in the 20th century.
Of course.
Are there any final thoughts that any of you have on the legacy of the Scopes trial, or either as we see it today, or things that you still see coming down the pipeline, so to speak, that we should perhaps be watching out for, or looking out for, in your minds and your views, or just any other closing thoughts that you may have about this?
I think, as a few people have said before, check your sources, get good information, learn the information. We've touched on a couple ideas I think that maybe people have different opinions about, and I don't think that we're trying to influence opinions. It's mostly about informing. And so I know, especially in my classes, even when we talk about evolution, I say, I'm not here to tell you what to think, but I want to give you the information that you can make up your own mind. And so I think that's, one of the things we could gather from all this, and especially going into the future with misinformation or whatever we might run into, especially from the science perspective, like, keep learning.
Yeah, great point, and I think the same goes for us. And sometimes as academics, as the William Jennings Bryan, if I'm not mistaken, he was also in favor of protectionism, and tariffs, are a big issue at that time as well as this time. And sometimes I wonder, as somebody who's been teaching political science for 20 years, and then when I go back home or talk to people who maybe don't follow politics like I do, I think there's just a gap of like, how do we as intellectuals or academics translate what we know and the facts that we know and the science that we have to not in a non-judgmental way to try to help people understand this, and not because this divide, I think, between us and them, not that we see it that way, but between the academics and people with an advanced degree and those without is just growing. And I think that's something to be aware of how we can depolarize and try to help inform each other and learn from each other, understand where each other's coming from.
Well said. Mary or Josh?
I was just going to say as a last thought that my teaching philosophy over the years has changed slightly from trying to share what I know to trying to lead my students to figure it out for themselves. And in critical thinking that works. Maybe wouldn't work so well in math class, but in critical thinking it works. And I do think that if you teach students how to, and people in general, how to find accurate, reliable, recent information, that they will come to a mostly rational set of conclusions. It's the information literacy portion of it that really is important to stress, I think, going forward.
I would just echo my colleagues. I'm listening to Mary and Kevin and Nick and going, I need to take all of your classes. You all are awesome. But I would agree completely about the centrality of the importance of, especially with history, of understanding the many layers and lenses to approaching an event, a system, a time. There's so many different perspectives and histories. I think it was either the OAH or the AHA that the tagline for one of the National Professional Historical Associations was everything has a history, and that is certainly a definitively true thing, and being able to make sure that we look at it through those multi-layered sort of lenses, and making sure that we're doing so with an understanding of the resources that we're looking at is, important now as much as it is at any other time.
Beautifully said. Thank you very much to Professors Nick Hackett and Josh Fulton, Mary Barney, Kevin Navratil. Thank you very much to the audience for attending. And thank you, Dr. Troy Swanson, for hosting us here. Come back, hopefully another 100 years we'll be here for the 200th anniversary of the Scopes trial. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for reminding me about Leopold and Loeb. I was like, I couldn't think of their names. I'm like, Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.